So we're Common Sense Incorporated, and we were hired by somebody here to answer a more qualitative, quantitative question than we've been talking about so far. And that question is, can we satisfy our drastically increasing energy needs by 2020 using natural gas from the Marcellus Shale formation? So we've got 8 years. Wait, where do you go? Yeah, go back. We have 8 years to come up with an extra 200 gigawatts. That's a 45% increase in what we're consuming right now. Does that mean we need to import 1.5 times as much oil? Do we need to go from 9 million barrels a day to 14 million barrels a day? I don't think so. We need to come up with an alternative option, and one of those proposed options is fracking natural gas from the Marcellus Shale formation. Slide. So currently we have 1.5 million wellheads coming up with 20 trillion cubic feet of gas per year. So there's 20 trillion cubic feet, and we need 8 more trillion cubic feet per year to come up with 200 gigawatts. That's the figure to keep in mind. 8 trillion more per year from 2020 on into the future forever, unless our power needs go back down, which is not going to happen. Slide. And this is going to be a video, so go ahead and play it. Here you can see most of the 5,500 wellheads that have been constructed in Pennsylvania are in the Marcellus Shale Basin since 2005. This is not all of them, but the majority of them are in Pennsylvania. So this is most of the 5,500 wellheads constructed in the Marcellus Shale Basin since 2005. And altogether, these produce about 3 trillion cubic feet, which does not count towards our goal of 8 trillion because this is 3 trillion that we're already using. So the question that we want to answer is, could we begin to harvest 8 trillion more per year from the Marcellus Shale Basin?
That's not right.
We got 8 years to get the infrastructure in place. Slide.
All right, so an important question that we need to ask is how much shale gas even exists. And estimates range from anywhere between 50 to 500 TCF, which is a pretty large range. And more estimates are even declining as low as 30 TCFs. And just to give you a better idea of how big 1 trillion cubic feet is, it's about 60 times the size of Sydney Harbor. So here's a graph of the high-end estimate of how much shale gas we have available, and from the Marcellus Shale formation, and a low-end estimate and how much gas demand there is. So that's looking pretty good right now. And now we look at how many producing wells we need to reach that 200 gigawatt goal. We would need about 1.7 new state-of-the-art wells per day. And right now, if you click this slide, we're currently building 2.5 wells per day, which is fantastic, right? Go ahead. So there's another graph of how much recoverable gas we have, what our demand is, and what our production would be according to that calculation made in the slide beforehand. And it looks like we'd be able to produce more than we even need.
And I'll tell you why that's false. So basically you have a well, and the first day it's operating, it's really efficient, it's brand new, and they do their fracking, and all that gas that's pent up blows through the wellhead. Well, the next day you lose 0.3%, and the next day another 0.3%, until eventually you lose 67% per year, which over year after year after year, basically these wells don't really make money for these corporations for very long. Maybe 3 years, maybe a decade for some of the very most efficient or productive wells, rather. Let's go to the next slide. So if you take into account this drop-off with building 2.5 wells, you see this is what happens without, this is with. So it's a lot of energy that you don't get with this drop-off included. Now, if we get the next slide. So maybe we should use average yield. It makes more sense to take, the lower end production wells are obviously pulling down production of the high end wells. So we came up with that it's about 1.5 million cubic feet per well. So we need to build about 15,000 new wells, about 5 per day, which is double what we're doing right now. The industry's been there before. They've done 5 wells a day. It seems pretty reasonable. But again, remember, even average will fall by this 0.3%. All these wells are losing over time. So you need to keep building wells to maintain production, which is what I'm going to talk about next. So our current well production of about 3 trillion cubic feet, let's see, let me get this figure up here. We're losing about 24 million cubic feet per day. Now that's the equivalent of building 5 new wells per day. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so before I discuss this table, I want to draw your attention to the top of the screen. Key assumption here is that we're building just enough wellheads to get to the capacity to produce 8 trillion more cubic feet by 2020. This isn't saying we just can get here and stop. You're going to have to build more wells, which I'll go into next. But in all reality, the industry isn't going to do this. They're not going to build all this infrastructure to just get to the point to be ready to. It's going to be a trend over time, which will, in any way we cut it, will actually increase these numbers. So let's just assume this for the time being. So we need the 1825 to maintain production of about 3 trillion, and we need about 600 per year to get to the point where we could get 8 trillion more cubic feet per year by 2020. So that's about 7 wells per day over the 8-year time span between now and 2020. Now we're set up, but let's look at what happens when we move into 2021, 2022. So as you can see, we have the 8 trillion more. We still have to keep the 5 new wells to keep the 3 trillion going. Now we need 16 more in addition to that, just to keep at that production level. So get the next slide. Some pretty simple math, but we need to build about 8,000 wells per year just to maintain this amount of gas production, which is, if you press it one more time, 21 wells per day. Now, the most they've ever built in a day is 5 on a long-term basis. That's 4 times that. Right now, 2.5. That's about 10 times that. So you see, it's not very feasible for this industry to be building this many wells. And what McCaw's going to tell you about is that spatially it doesn't work either. That resources can't handle this amount of wells per year.
My name is Maka, and I'm going to be talking about what building 21 wells per day looks like in terms of the water consumption that it requires that the health group talked about, as well as the space that is actually required to do this. So if we can take a look at the water use first, we can see that we need 5.6 million gallons of water per well in order to do all of the drilling, and in addition to that, all of the fracking that goes into that. So that's 5.6 million gallons of water according to the Chesapeake Energy Company. And then that gives about 123.2 million gallons of water per day if we build 21 wells per day, which results in us needing 44.3 billion gallons of water per year. So over the course of the 8-year build-up to this, we would need about 354.4 billion gallons over 8 years, which is sort of an difficult to conceptualize number, but that's about 0.3% of the size of Lake Erie, which is one of the largest lakes in the world. And while it may not seem like that much water, then we can continue to use all of that water for fracking, because it's that's a very small fraction of the amount of Lake Erie. Bear in mind that this water comes back up and then needs to be stored somewhere until all of the carcinogens like benzene and stuff like that are no longer in the water, which we don't really have a very good method for doing. So we would really, basically, in order to do this, need a wastewater pool that's well much smaller than Lake Erie, still very large, and we don't really have a good place to put that right now. So that's one problem with building this many wells per day. More pressing than that is the actual space that we need to build a well. In order for wells to produce at the maximum level of efficiency, we need to be able to give each. We can build a maximum of 8 wells per square mile. So if we consider that 8 wells per square mile, then we need approximately 8,000 square miles in order to build all of the wells that we need to build by 2020, which is, again, a hard to think about number. So we can realize that that's about 20% of all of Pennsylvania, which, you know, the figure that was showed earlier of all the wells being built in Pennsylvania looks like quite a few wells are being built in Pennsylvania right now. But those wells are not being built at maximum density. If we were to truly consider building all of the wells that we need at maximum density in Pennsylvania, that 20% of Pennsylvania would end up looking something like this picture, which would displace probably a lot of people that live in Pennsylvania and sort of turn Pennsylvania into kind of a wasteland, which doesn't really seem like that good of an idea. Now, perhaps you're thinking that, well, it's fine, we can get rid of like all of Pennsylvania and create a very, very large toxic wastewater dump and stuff like that and just run our...
Sell tickets.
You know, that's just the stuff that we need to get up into this energy level. So once we get there, you know, it's not a big of a deal. We just need to sustain this. We only need to turn 2% of Pennsylvania into this every single year, right? That seems like a very reasonable thing. And we can do that for the next few years. That unfortunately fails to take into account the fact that our demand increases over time. This is why the other group that said that we could run this for 5 years was not quite right, because we burn more fuel each year, and the figure of us needing to build 8 trillion cubic feet more, the figure of us needing 200 gigawatts more electricity assumes a 4.3% growth rate over every single year, and if we extrapolate based on that and consider a growth rate of 4.3% for the next 10 years into 2030, we can see that our water use goes up in a similar manner, and we end up needing about 1.5 trillion gallons of water, which is a very sizable amount. It's actually 1.2% of Lake Erie. And we also, our land requirements go up, and we end up needing about 75% of Pennsylvania in order to build all of the things that we need to over the next 10 years, which would be fairly unsustainable and probably displace a lot of people from their homes in Pennsylvania, because you can't live close to gas wells, especially if there are 8 of those in every single square mile. So, we're going to have a discussion now, or?
No, that's fine. You're done. It's good. I had one question. So before a general discussion here, I think you have something that's wrong with your scaling. At least I hope so. You said that there's 5,500 wells that produce 3 trillion cubic feet. That can't be right.
That's, where did we get that? You guys remember?
What's the number?
Well, you've got 500,000 wells in the U.S.
right.
doing 20 trillion cubic feet, so
Yes.
how can 5,500 produce?
500,000, that's including all the antiquated ones that have been running forever and barely produce any yield. So if we were to use state-of-the-art wells, then the number would be a lot lower.
Oh, okay.
5,500.
So these are essentially 5,500 that would initially produce
And they're newer wells.
before
They're
decaying.
much more
Okay.
efficient.
All right.
Marcellus.
Right.
And the number you gave us, which was what, like 450,000?
487,000, that's
what
everything.
What happens is these wells lose so much productivity that they turn it back over to the landowner, and it's like giving out some tiny little amount, but they hook it up directly to their house, so they have like free gas.
Okay, but so it's still
not
counted.
like industrial, they're not selling that. So.
All right. Thank you.